Welcome to the Dying Your Way podcast. We have a very special guest today, someone that I've admired her work and have just recently connected with. And she is she's a mentor to a lot of doulas, particularly in Canada. That's where she's from. Her name is Sarah Kerr, PhD. She has a lot of knowledge base in sacred death care. In fact, she has the Center for Sacred Death Care in Canada. And it's an online business too, but it's also very focused on the importance of ritual at the end of life. And my work tends to be a little bit more practical from the point of view of from the diagnosis to journeying with the patient and their families. But I really haven't been trained or know a lot about rituals. And that's why I wanted to have Sarah on today, because she's an expert at this. And I've just really learned a lot, not only from listening to her on YouTube or different webinars that we've both been on, but she's got a fabulous website that has a lot of information, and we'll be talking about that. But she's a lovely human being on top of everything else. She's just a lovely human being. So with further ado, I introduce you to Sarah Kerr, PhD. Here's Sarah. Hi, Sarah.
Hello, Claire. Thanks so much for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to join you here.
I'm
looking forward to our conversation.
I can't tell you how happy I am that we're talking again. I can't say your name without going, Sarah Kerr, PhD. It just flows together.
Oh, that's nice.
So you're in Vancouver, or in the Vancouver area in Canada, right?
I'm on Vancouver Island, which is in the city of Victoria.
Okay.
So Vancouver's over on the mainland. So on the west coast of Canada, just north of Seattle, basically.
So do you easily go back and forth from the States into Canada? And
well, I've only lived here for 6 months. I moved from Calgary. So I was in the foothills and further east.
Okay.
We called it the West there. But yeah, so I haven't been here really since COVID has opened up. But my sense is it's pretty easy. There's a ferry just down there that goes right across to Port Angeles.
Yeah. Well, it's like you've got the best of both worlds there. You're in a good spot. Well, so you've been in Calgary. You have this business. I mean, you're very in tune to death care in Canada. Not that it's any so different other places, but how would you define the end of life care in Canada?
Well, that's a big question. And as you know, of course, there's a big breadth to what end of life care is. And there's the mainstream models of hospice and palliative and all social work and support that goes around that. And that's not really where my focus is. Like you and like many people probably who are listening to this, I'm in this complementary stream. Death doulas and other folks who are part of this emerging movement are working, I really feel, parallel to that mainstream medical model to support a broader, more complete picture of what it means to be human as we're meeting death for ourselves and those people we know. So in terms of that in Canada, it's pretty exciting. There have been, I guess I've been practicing for about 10 years and teaching for a good long portion of that. And back then there were not very many of us. And now there have been enough teachers and trainers and people studying and really people finding their way into this movement that there's a pretty exciting community of folks all across the country doing this, thinking about it, developing new ways. It's exciting to see, and it's really important.
Yeah, I'm constantly amazed at the topic of end of life, and you'd think that there wouldn't be a lot to talk about once you've talked about everything, and then there is just this whole new thing that opens up and it's really worth exploring, which is your work specifically with rituals. And really, at one point you said that you're the clergy for the unchurched. It really is it's really something to explore, that you could spend a lot of time just on that topic. What was it about your life that really led you to focus on that particular particular area?
I've always been drawn to working in groups and to the kind of group culture, almost group body that
Mm.
develops when you're with a group that's meshing. In my 20s, I was a backcountry guide and I led trips for Outward Bound and the National Outdoor Leadership School. I did these big, long, sometimes 30-day trips with
You're a
20
healthy
students.
person.
I love that work. I did it for a long time. And there was something magical that happened. You get 20 people out in the woods. There's a way we became a single organism.
Mhm.
And we'd feel and sense as a body. And so and I've done various different things since then, but it's always involved leading or being with or facilitating or supporting people to be connected in groups.
Mm.
And when we're facing death, either for ourselves or for someone we love, the thing that makes it bearable is connection and relationship and support. Stephen Jenkinson says the mark of a good death is that it's a village-making event.
Mhm.
So the task when we're dying or facing a death is to make village, is to find a way to come together and support each other at an energetic and spiritual level. And you talked about the fact I call myself clergy for the unchurched,
Yeah.
because the people I work with recognize that death is part of their sacred journey, but they often don't have a map. I mean, if they do, if they have a religious or a cultural tradition that guides them through it, they'll have a ritual map, a set of processes. But if you don't, if you know it's sacred, and you kind of feel like you should be praying, but you don't know how or to who or what, that's where I come in.
Mhm.
So it's helping people come together and connect spiritually in the biggest, most inclusive sense of that word, really finding whatever you hold sacred.
Mm.
But it tends to be in a kind of nature-based frame. How do you bring people into that? So that's really my flow from working with groups to working with the collective around death and dying is a big part of it. Well, my dad had a huge stroke and that threw me into it personally. That played a big role. I ended up doing my doctorate on ritual and initiation. And of course, death is a huge initiation ritual. So studying it academically, done a lot of training in shamanic and other kinds of healing modalities. So those all fit together, but really it's that interconnection that has been the through line for me.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about death as an initiation, because that's going to be a new concept for people.
So in traditional cultures from whom we are all descended, and even many, many contemporary cultures too, but not so much in dominant Western culture where I live, there was an understanding that we move through these different phases in our lives. They're developmental phases. You're a child, you're an adolescent, you're an adult, you become a parent, perhaps you become married or partnered in there into a certain work role, into an elder, and then you die. There are these phases. Hopefully you die at the end of those, but sometimes you die earlier in that process. And at each of those phases, there's a big shift, and you have to let the old you die so the new you can be born. So someone who's single and is getting married, there's a death of a single person. You have to let that die in order for the married person to be born. Death of the person without a child, birth of the parent. And so those were ritualized each stage along the way so that the ritual allowed one part to die and it supported the death of one. So you could kind of let that go and step into the next. And sometimes it was even a change of name. And we do that too. There's some things change our
And
names.
usually there's a ceremony of some sort involved. Yeah.
Yes. And so that's initiation is that death and rebirth process. And the rite of passage is the ceremony that's around that. It's an initiation ritual. And so it's death and birth all the way along.
Mhm.
And if we're living our lives awake and aware and connected, we're attuned to those deaths and births and deaths and births and deaths and births. And they train us and prepare us for the bigger deaths we face in our lives when someone we love dies. That's a death of a relationship, death of a way of being with that person.
An
So
identity. Yeah.
there's death all over, not just the person who's dying.
Yeah.
So initiation fits into all of those, and we meet death in terms of an initiation. Yes, my partner died. And there is a new me who will be born on the other side of it. I might not choose that, but there is a new me I need to let be born or support being born. So really that frame gives us a way to understand what's happening. And death is not just the end. Death is the end of one and the beginning of the next. And that's what allows us to roll through it at a soul level.
You also were very, great in describing the importance and what is holding space. Now, as doulas, we are trained in holding space, but often I find myself training others when I'm not there, or even if I am, to hold space. And I particularly love how you describe that. Maybe I read it on your website. I can't remember, but you just did a great job describing it. And if you could share that with our listeners, because I think it's really important for them to have an awareness of that if they're walking into a deathbed scenario, what's expected of them or not.
So in that death and rebirth process, there's a coming undone. Everything kind of disconnects and who we are and who we knew we were. People understand it's like nothing makes sense anymore. My world's been turned upside down. That's part of the initiatory process. And when we're supported around that, someone holds a container. And so it's literally like a bounded space, energetically bounded, in which someone can come undone, but not completely dissolve because you're holding that space. And holding that space is actually what gives them the safety and the security to be able to come undone so that they can let the old go and allow the new to be born. So holding space, I guess I'll talk about what it is, and then I'll talk about the difference between grievers and helpers, because I think that's useful for people to be able to articulate that. So holding space is a kind of, for me, I feel it in my body. It's like I sink my roots down, I get low. I'm a kind of tuning fork in the space. So that's one part of it. It's a kind of energetic grounding that you bring to the space. It's also the logistical things that make people feel safe. So when I'm facilitating a ritual, the opening and how I describe what's going to happen and giving people permission to participate or not participate and how each person checks in and how people build trust. And you start to build this container where people say, okay, I'm safe here. I can trust her. I can trust that I'm going to be okay here. Okay, I can take a risk. I can be vulnerable. I can let this grief out because there are some structures to hold it, because grief is very disorienting. So holding space is all the practices that create the container, but it's also how we configure ourselves internally to be unflustered and undaunted by whatever comes up. One of the things I love to talk about it is how what we share as end-of-life practitioners and death doulas and death workers, what we share with people is our lack of fear. So when we walk into the space and say, I know you're really scared, but I'm not scared. This is something that is possible to meet without being afraid.
Yeah.
It's sad and it's hard. So that's whatever you bring up, whatever grief, whatever anger, I'm not afraid of it. I can be with you. That's a holding space skill. And so for people who do this professionally, if something happens in our family, sometimes we can get a little scrambled up because we feel like, oh, I have these skills. I want to support my family because I know how to do it. I should be holding space for people. Well, yes, but it's also important that you have an opportunity to grieve. And so it's one thing if you're coming in as a practitioner or even as a friend who's coming in as a little bit distant, you're there as a helper. When you're a helper, you hold space. And you hold space for grievers. If you're in the system and you're right there, really close to the loss yourself, you can't hold space all the time.
So true.
Because you need to be able to grieve. So that the art is to be able to know when you're stepping into grieving and stepping into holding space. And ideally, people take turns holding space. So when there's no practitioner supporting people in the system, somebody's holding it and then somebody else's. You step into helper and out of helper, into griever, from griever to helper to griever to helper. And I think it's an important differentiation to learn to configure our energy bodies. You know, those of us called to this work are often very sensitive to spiritual and energetic information. We're attuned somatically and through our nervous system to things that other people might not be so sensitive to. And that ability to have an internal is almost like a radio dial, and to tune it to a variety of different channels depending on what you need is a gift that you have if you are that sensitive, and it's an incredible gift to bring to this work.
You know, you talked about at the very beginning about holding space as being a container. And, you know, I find that and I loved how you talked about grievers and helpers in that space, and knowing when you're wearing this hat and when you're wearing that hat. And what is so important, container, I also think about boundaries. And as professional doulas who aren't afraid to walk into that space to be able to create that container, it's really important for you to be aware of your own boundaries and where you are not becoming energetically enmeshed into the process of what's going on. And I don't think that's really taught a lot. You know, some people just naturally are gifted, but knowing those roles and the responsibilities that go with any role that we're playing is part of the boundary setting, and being able to have the awareness of mind, the mindfulness of, now I'm a griever, now I'm a helper, you know, and passing the baton when you can't do this anymore, you know.
I have a course on my website, a downloadable course called Subtle Energy Principles for Sacred Death Care. And it talks a lot about that. Not only when am I emotionally entangled, when you're in the space. So there's all these energetic tools. How do we configure ourselves before we go in so that we're open-hearted, we're connected, and people can feel us connecting with them, but we're not so wide open that we can be taken down by the intensity of the grief. So there are ways to configure ourselves as we go in. There are things to do when we're in there to, like, we're with grief and we feel with people, but sometimes it happens to me. Sometimes it's just really sad and I feel myself starting to fall down a hole of grief, and that doesn't serve the family. So how do I bring myself back up? All of those tools, and then maybe it's afterwards, right? You've done it, you've been holding it, you've held it together for them. This is when it is useful to hold it together because you're holding it for other people. But then you leave, and sometimes that's when the intensity.
Yeah.
So there are practices all the way along, because they say getting enmeshed and entangled doesn't serve you and it doesn't serve the people you're working with.
No. I used to go into prisons and teach meditation, and I had to go through a lot of training to get to that point, to do that. And one of the exercises that we were taught was to just visualize or pretend that there was a glass wall between you and them, and that your heart could be wide open and you could be authentic, but nothing was going to come through that wall. And, you know, it was that you can't con a con, that you really do need to be authentic when you're, you know, teaching anyone. But that was a real necessity, a requirement to be able to do that work. And I've thought about that a lot when I'm working with families and other people, because you do want to be, you know, a coming from your heart, you know, doing the work. But it's those boundaries, I think, are so important.
And those images, the open heart and the glass wall, using that image actually is what configures the energy. The image I often use is that I move my feeling sense to the edge of my aura. So it's a similar configuration probably, but I have a different image for it, so that I connect with people out here. Again, nothing comes in, all the connections out there, but I'm feeling It's something different if you configure your aura or your boundary like a mirror.
Hmm.
Then people can't get in, they bounce back. That has a different reaction.
Hmm.
Or so for people who maybe are new to this idea of how do you configure yourself in a certain way, that image is a really core part of it.
Hmm.
The image tells your brain, and your brain works your system to match that image.
There's a physicality that sets into that. Um, the Yeah, you talked about having the energetic PPE, that you got to put on the energetic PPE before you
Mhm.
go in. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
That's true.
And to know what it is to take it off in the end,
Hmm.
what your long-term health is. Because, of course, we know there's vicarious PTSD. If you're around really difficult things, it starts to impact you.
Hmm.
You need tools to stay, yeah, to stay clear and healthy and resilient and resourced. And that being said, I don't want to scare people off who are maybe new to this, thinking that it's kind of emotionally dangerous to go in there. Mostly go in there, go to be with dying people and grieving people. Mostly, in my experience, it's incredibly heart opening because there's
Hmm.
so much love. So these, like, keeping yourself protected is an important thing, but you don't have to be all guarded all the time, because mostly it's wide open heart flow. That's what you're immersed in. It looks like grief, but it really is love.
Yeah, I was on a ward in a hospital with a hospice patient. The hospice unit was full, so this particular patient was on the ward, and I said, well, I'll go down there and be with him because his wife wanted to go feed the dogs, and I said, don't worry about it. I'll be with him until you get back. Well, while I was there, he was like doing the classic end of life terminal agitation, and I got hold of the doctor and made the observation that he was there, and they helped him take care of that. And the doctor left the room, the nurses left the room, and maybe in 5 minutes he started the breathing, looked up, looked through me, went back, a few more breaths, he was gone. And it was something that, I was just really glad that he wasn't alone. However, I think he was waiting for his wife to leave so he could do that. But another observation that I had was that the nurses who had been caring for him were all in the hallway crying, and they were really upset. And I was trying to understand that and realize that they had no training in their patients dying. They're used to their patients living,
Because it wasn't
and
a hospice ward.
they were distraught, that the gentleman had died, and it was just an interesting observation to see someone die in a hospital ward where normally they would have been in the hospice unit. Here in Australia, they don't die at home as much here as, unfortunately, as they do in the United States anyway.
Yeah, it's really a skill. And there's so many amazing things about the medical system and what it offers us. And what I wish it would offer is more support for the people in it to
Hmm.
feel more comfortable about death,
Hmm.
both for their own well-being, so
Hmm.
they have more skills to deal with it, but also so they can be more comfortable and bring that lack of fear to the conversations with patients and families.
Yeah, and anticipate what those trans transitions to the big transition
Yes.
are, so they can support each other as a team, and they can support the families. Jumping the shark here, tell us about the work that you're doing with William Peters, because I heard you in a webinar with him. I was fascinated with his work, and it was, again, a new terminology for me. I had experienced it and knew what it was, didn't know it had a name: shared death experiences. So
Let me
let's
see
talk
if I've
about
got, there
that.
you go. Okay. We'll do a little commercial for William's book,
Yeah.
which is called At Heaven's Door,
Uh-huh.
What Shared Journeys to the Afterlife Teach Us About Dying Well and Living Better by William J. Peters.
And
So
he's
William
not
is a,
paying you to do that.
oh God, no, no, he's a friend and a colleague, and we've been working together for a long time, and
Yeah, yeah,
I'm just a big fan of what
yeah.
he does. Um, so William has done some research around, as you say, what lots of people know and experience, but don't necessarily have language for, which is the non-ordinary, mystical, magical, transcendent experiences that happen at the end of life. And we have lots of stories of these happening for dying people. The dying person, they see people, they hear things, all sorts of things start to change as the veil lifts and becomes more permeable. And so that happens to the dying person, and sometimes they actually die in a near-death experience, say they're on the operating table, and they come back. And so they have a really intense version of that journey and back. In those situations, they're dying. There's something physiologically wrong with them. And so mainstream medicine hasn't given a lot of credence to those experiences because there's a physiological distortion happening. So maybe that's changing what's happening in their mind. So it sort of writes it off. The shared death experience, which is a term that was coined by Raymond Moody, and William has been working with him too. The shared death experience, Raymond also coined near death experience. Shared death experience is when those things happen to friends, caregivers, bystanders, strangers. So every hospice nurse, many, many people, when someone they know is dying, things happen. We see things, we hear things, we get woken up in the middle of the night with visions in the end of our bed. There's a whole spectrum of them. Sometimes the geometry of the room starts to change and the corners get not quite right angles and the light can change and there's music. There are all these things, and those are the subtle versions of them, and they really go a long way. They're rarer, not that rare. More and more deep, deep, complex experiences of the veil opening when someone we're with is dying and we get a glimpse across. And so William's done this research, and I think it's really important because it can't be refuted by some kind of allopathic model that says, well, they're hallucinating because they're dying. Because these are people who are sound of mind and body. And it gives a new way of thinking about this and a new validity to it. And I know in my work with families, a lot of what I do is teach the dying person and teach the person around, the people around them, what this can look like, how to recognize it, all the different ways it can show up, and how to meet it in a way that doesn't diminish it. Because it's really, in my mind, the other world kind of reaching through to have a connection as this person makes the journey across. And so overcome some kind of energy that gives us something we see or hear. And if we diminish it and say, oh, that's crazy, or like, my God, this seems really
Or become
weird,
afraid of it.
become afraid of it, or yeah, anything. If we do anything to shut it down, it shuts it down. But my advice to people is learn what it is, but then if it happens, lean into it. Just soften, shut down the talky critic voice up here. Just lean into it and see what happens. Because sometimes what happens is stunningly beautiful. Sometimes it's quite subtle on the outside, but what's really powerful is how it feels. We know something was different. We know something happened. And that deep knowing that we can't prove to anybody, but we know, that knowing and that experience of there being something bigger, something more. This death is not just this life and this body and it ends and everything ends. It's like this death and all life is held in a bigger field, in a bigger picture where there's something happening that we can't understand. And it goes a long way towards making death bearable. It's always going
Oh,
to be hard.
yeah,
It's
it
going to be
can be
sad, but
very
maybe we can.
validating. I've probably told you this story before, but I think it's worth sharing now because I said I didn't know that this had a name. But then after your webinar, and I started thinking back in my life of experiences that I was around or I personally had, my daughter was oldest daughter was like 2 years old. She was a very verbal 2 year old, but she was 2 years old. And my husband at the time, his brother died tragically. He was young, was in the hospital. We got the call from them, from my mother-in-law, come to the hospital. So we loaded the kids up in the Volkswagen bus van, and Piper is standing between us as we're getting ready to take off, and she says, I give Joe Pat a kiss, I give Joe Pat a hug, and I say, night night, Joe Pat. And Steve and I had this moment where we just went and looked at each other, and we both knew he was gone when Piper said that. And then we get to the hospital, and of course, that was true. And then later on, I was in the downstairs bedroom, and I was shedding tears. Everyone was very upset about this death. And Piper, the 2-year-old, toddled in there, and she was just like, it's okay, Mommy, Joe Pat's with God. And it's just like, how does a 2-year-old know that? How does a 2-year-old say things like that? And I was like, oh, that was a shared death experience that Piper was having with her. And this brother that died, he was actually her godfather. So there was kind of a connection there anyway. But it's fascinating and shouldn't be discounted.
No, it's important. And what's important is that we make space for it and acknowledge that these things happen. What meaning we make of them is different. So that's really a gift of William's work, is that he identifies that if we teach people that they happen, teach people this is what it can look like, teach people how to recognize it, and then let people make their own meaning of that. And different traditions, different cultures, different people will assign a different meaning to it, but at least we make space for the experience. We don't invalidate those experiences, because that's just such a traumatic process to have our experiences invalidated.
Have you had an experience?
I've first one that comes to mind is, I haven't had really radical ones, but arriving in a family's in a hospital room just after someone had died. It was a client, and coming in and having the sense, and this was the guy who died, this was really his quality. I could feel him, almost see him, the way you can see these things, in the room, and he was sitting up and in the corner, and he looked like a little leprechaun Buddha. And that was exactly who he was. And I'd never had that image of him before. He was totally serene, but he was a little mischievous. And we did a ceremony, and he was there. We did the ceremony, and we released his spirit, and we opened the window, and I could feel him go. And 2 other people in the room could feel a breeze as we opened the window and he left. They could feel this whoosh come past. So things like that. And I've had clients who are, well, it's not shared death, I guess, the dying people experiencing lots of those things.
Yeah, and Danish, by their culture and tradition, that's what they do when someone dies, is they open the window.
Yeah. Oh, in many hospitals, I know this happens. I always do it if we can. It's kind
great.
Of returning.
So tell us about psychopomps. You've got it. It's on your website, and just even going in there, I'm going to talk about your website again because I love it. There is like these free videos. They're short, but boy, they just give so much. So that was one of my initial impressions of you, is how generous you were, because here you are giving this knowledge that's fascinating away for free. And one of those videos was about psychopomps. Again, I had no idea what a psychopomp was, but boy, I was going to go there to find out. So tell us.
Well, thank you. I appreciate hearing that. I really get excited about sharing this, and it's my joy to teach it. So I'm always happy when it's finding its way out there in the world. So psychopomp. Psyche is Greek for soul. Like we have a psychotherapist, psychiatric, those are all soul, comes from that same word. Psyche is soul, which incidentally in Greek, psyche means butterfly. So soul and butterfly are the same.
Oh, wow.
That metamorphosis, caterpillar to butterfly,
Wow.
So there's a little history there. So psyche is soul, and pomp means guide or progression.
Pomp and
So a psycho
circumstance.
pomp and circumstance, yeah, exactly, down the aisle. That's the
Yeah,
progression.
love that.
So there's the etymology. So a psychopomp is a soul guide, and we could call them the angels of death. They're the spirit beings that know the way between this world and the other. And when I talk to the clients and families about this,
You need a glass of water?
yeah, I think I might just grab one. Sorry, I think I'll be coughing. I'm right
Okay.
here.
And I'll put the cough drop in for you. No, I just thought it was fascinating just hearing the concept of psychopomp. And yeah, it's
Yeah, sorry about that. Thanks.
mm,
Yes. So psychopomp means soul guide, and that's this being that guides us from this side of the veil to the other. And as I say, I talk about this with families. Sometimes I say you can take that literally. You can actually hold it as a spirit being that does this, or maybe you can take it as it's the wisdom of the cosmos. There's a wisdom that knows how grass grows and how rain falls. There's a wisdom that knows how we leave our bodies, the same way there's a wisdom that knows how babies are born and come in. So psychopomps are these spirit forces, energies, archetypal powers, you could call them lots of things, but they are present around a death. And they're really, for me, they're my allies. They're who I work with. And I have ones I work with personally. And then when I'm working with clients, we often do some work to explore who their psychopomp being is. And the psychopomps start to gather as death starts to approach. And even if it's a sudden death, they're here. It might be a surprise to us, but they start to gather. And they are one of the archetypal energies we can collaborate with. We can engage and work with in this process. And when people start to connect with who their psychopomp being is and start to make that relationship, they start to show up in dreams. They start to become more present. And there's this idea that, okay, I'm slipping out of this body and I'm going to be in this energetic landscape that's new and unfamiliar, but I have a guide who will help me find my way. And so, yes, I have a short course on my website. It's four little videos and a downloadable course, and it gives a real introduction to really what the word is and how people talk about doing psychopomp work. Well, what's that? There's just a clarification of terminology and really how to work with psychopomp beings.
just even, again, having the awareness that to me, it's comforting knowing that everybody, it's not based on religion, but everybody will have someone guiding them during this huge transition.
And it shows up, this energy. The way I hold it is that it's an objective underlying energy, but it shows up in a way that's palatable and recognizable to different people. So it kind of arrives in a different form, but it's the same energy. And we know that when people have near-death experiences, they meet a guide very often. They meet someone who conveys them, and in a
And
near-death
family
experience,
members, dead
yeah,
family
family
members being,
members,
yeah.
animals, people they have never seen before and don't recognize. Sometimes it's even just a warm light. But it's something, there's a consciousness and an accompanying. And in a near-death experience, it accompanies you so far, and then at some point, it says, you can't come any further, you have to go back, right? Those are people who aren't, or maybe the person themselves says, I'm not ready to go yet, and they come back. But that's how we know about them, is from those experiences people have had of going in and coming back.
Are you familiar with Peter Finnick's work?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I know
He's
his general work.
Well, he quotes Monica Rentz, who's an oncologist in Switzerland, who's done a lot of studies, not unsimilar to just the methodology of how William Peters went about doing his studies. So it's really grounded in science in these studies, but it was about what constituted a good death and who were the people that were having a good death, and what constituted a good death was relatively pain-free and anxiety-free. And the people that had the best outcomes were people that were had a near-death experience, had a near-death awareness, or had a spiritual belief in an afterlife. Those three groups of people, 80% of them had, what you would qualify as a good death. The fourth group, which was really surprising and probably why I do this podcast, is that people that were just curious about death, people that talked about death, people that listened to podcasts about death, doing death over dinner, whatever. The people that were curious about death, 80% of them had a good death. So I just
That's
a big takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, I tread very carefully around what a good death is in terms of, sometimes there are just physiological things happening that are really rough. It doesn't matter what you think or believe.
Yeah.
The body is not going to leave easily. So that's a delicate question, but it is very interesting to really, what those all say to me is there are people who are not afraid.
Mm-hmm.
They're not afraid because they're curious, or their curiosity has made them not afraid, or they're not afraid because they have some sense that there's some safety, there's something.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things that really makes death difficult and in a way so dysfunctional in Western culture is that we don't have a sense that there's something else. We're such a materialist culture. We believe that we pop into life, live in a straight line, and then we pop out, and that's it. Life is like this, and there's no before, and there's no after. And so when we start to move towards our death, and there's nothing, non-existence, non-connection, nothing, that's very scary. The human psyche does not want to not exist or not be connected.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know if you're comfortable talking about this, but you've had your own health scare recently. How has that changed your work, or has it changed your work?
Oh, radically. So in July of 2019, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And it's been a big journey through there. I had surgery. Fortunately, chemo was not recommended. It wasn't on the table for me. So fortunately, unfortunately, I don't know. I didn't have that. And radiation, all of that. And now I'm through the other side. I've been discharged by my oncologist, so that's good. So it all feels like I'm not taking anything for granted, but I'm feeling pretty good about it. It changed everything. It turned everything upside down. There's a friend just put in such direct words. She said, when it happened to her, she said, I felt like I was in a room and suddenly in that doctor's appointment, energetically, someone opened a door, pushed me through the door and slammed the door again. And I'm never going to go back to that room I was in before cancer. We're always in the other side. And so it changes everything. It changes my relationship with life. It changes my relationship with death. I really met it, and I think, I attribute my work with death and my learning around being with death and mortality. I really met it as an indication that something was out of balance in my life. And this cancer was my body's natural and logical response to something that was out of balance. And I really tried to look at everything. Is it diet? Is it exercise? Is it some toxins I've been exposed to? Is it ancestral? Is it karmic? Is it emotional? Is it psychological? All of those things. And to try and see where things needed to come back into balance so that I wouldn't, this message my body was giving me, pay attention, something's not right, something's not right. And that was a deep, deep journey. And I continue to be on that. But it just, I think, gave me a deeper perspective on what my clients are going through. And now, just not surprisingly, I guess I have a number of clients who are facing cancer, maybe not terminal, they've just stepping into cancer and they want to meet that in a soul-based way. So a lot of my one-on-one work is around that and how to meet that in some of the things I did in a really ritual way.
Yeah.
As a way to navigate that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, physician heal thyself, or the accountant that doesn't take care of their own books. And it's just like, here, I do so much around advanced care planning and things like that. And I am so aware of the things in my life that need to be updated, or, and the importance of having a team around you, people in your lives that can be there so you can have, for me, a natural death at home is what I want. But boy, you have to have people around you.
Takes a village.
Go back to Stephen Jenkinson. I'm going to interview him next week.
Oh yeah, he's great.
No, I've interviewed him before, but it's very challenging.
He's a visionary.
He is a visionary, and he has words that are, to me, it sounds like poetry. So I really have to translate it so I can, it challenges me to my nth degree. It really does.
Good for
you. What I really wanted to say, Sarah, thank you so much for this time that you've given me to explore this topic. And I know there's a lot more to explore, and this just doesn't even give it the credit that it's due. But, if I was, I just think you'd be a wonderful teacher to study with. If people wanted to reach out to you and find out more about the work that you do, what would be the best way to do that?
The best way is through my website, the Center for Sacred Death Care. I have Instagram and Facebook and YouTube, all that stuff.
And we'll have those links down below. So
yeah, the website's there. There, as you say, there are lots of videos there and courses. I'm building a library of courses, so I teach them and I put them up, and then they're available. So I've got a number of them up there now. And if people are starting, I would say the free Introduction to Psychopomp course is a good place to start. And if that speaks to you, the next one would be a course called Awakening the Archetype of a Death Walker. And that's really designed for people who feel this inner calling, this nudging from inside to support death and dying and grieving people. And how to understand that as an archetypal energy that's coming through in a culture that doesn't recognize or validate that energy. So it gives people a real language for what they're experiencing and a way of understanding it as something useful and natural and normal and not kind of an aberration, which is what West culture often names this. So again, on my website, easy to follow. And I have a newsletter that comes out once a week with little videos in it that are quick and just little synopses.
I'm on your mailing list. It's a lovely newsletter. It really is. But I just think you really you lift up the quality of this work that we do, and it's just so great to have a circle of people that are part of the same choir that I really admire their work and what they're doing. And you're definitely one of those people. So.
Well, thank you so much. Well, I want to thank you for your work and spreading the word, because that's, I really rely on people like you and all the listeners also to change this conversation. I think where we've come in 10 years. Right? It's just amazing. And it's through things like these podcasts.
Just one last thing. If you could change anything about end of life for everybody, what would that be?
Well, for everybody, I don't think everybody has the problems with end of life that people in dominant Western culture have. So I would like to change things for that, because I think we are particularly dysfunctional. I'll use that word again. And what I'd like to change is this understanding that we are what we can see and count and measure. Just an opening to the understanding that there is an energetic and spiritual dimension that can be independent of a religion. Mm-hmm. It's my niece, when she was about 6, we were having a conversation, and somehow we got in a conversation about soul, and she said, "What's a soul?" I thought, well, God, I should be able to answer this question. And what I finally came to for a 6-year-old is, when you love someone, you love their soul. You don't love the color of their hair or their height or what they do for their job or, any of those kind of things. You love their soul. And so there's something about us that has to do with love, gratitude, and compassion and connection that is non-physical. And we need a framework and a language for talking about that soul part of us, which is what separates from the body. We understand the body part when we're dying. We need to understand the soul part. And many, many other cultures and people all around the world and in North America know those things. We just have lost that.
We've lost that, yeah. Well, Sarah, thank you very much. I've loved talking with you. And
Thank you
I
so
look
much.
forward to talking to you again.
Yes, I do too. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.